Every day, as the afternoon sun dipped behind the faded brick buildings of suburban Pittsburgh, a peculiar sight unfolded on the steps outside the local public library. Most people didn't even notice him, just a solitary figure, still as a statue, sitting on a battered wooden bench beneath the sycamore trees. No sign, no words. He just sat there, silent and invisible, with only the sound of passing cars and the distant chatter of school kids filling the air. His presence was a puzzle wrapped in plain sight. Jasmine Lee first noticed him on a Tuesday. She'd just finished her shift shelving books, hands stained faintly with dust and the scent of old paper, when she caught a glimpse of him through the window. An old man, his posture slumped, his faded army jacket catching the late autumn light. It was the jacket that drew her gaze. The kind with too many stories stitched into its seams, patches frayed, colors dulled by time and rain. He wore scuffed boots, laces knotted and reknotted, the soles worn thin as if he'd walked across decades. His hair was silver, sparse, tucked beneath a battered ball cap, and his eyes, though she couldn't see them clearly at first, seemed to scan the horizon, not searching for anyone, but waiting for something that might never come. The bench had been his for weeks, always the same time, 3 p.m. sharp. He'd shuffle in, settle himself quietly, and simply watch the world move past him. No begging, no talking. The regulars had their routines, and so did he. Students streamed in from the nearby high school, some tossing glances, most just ignoring the old man as if he were part of the scenery, a weathered fixture outside the library like the rusty bike rack or the flower beds neglected by city gardeners. It was easy to overlook someone like him. The world did it every day. But Jasmine saw things differently. Maybe it was because she'd spent her whole life trying to read between the lines, between the covers of books, between the looks people gave each other when they thought nobody was watching. Her dad used to tell her, "Pay attention to the quiet ones, Jazz. They usually have the best stories." Even though her dad had been gone for years now, those words clung to her like a favorite sweater. On that particular Tuesday, Jasmine lingered at the door, watching as the man unwrapped a sandwich from his pocket. Stale, clearly yesterday's, maybe the day before that. He ate slowly, methodically, eyes never leaving the steady flow of life that crossed in front of him, kids racing their bikes, parents herding toddlers, teens scrolling on their phones. Occasionally, someone would glance his way, maybe give a half smile, but nobody stopped. Nobody ever stopped. That night, Jasmine lay in bed, the image of the old man etched into her mind. There was a loneliness about him, a heaviness she couldn't shake. She wondered what his name was, where he went when the sun slipped away, whether anyone was waiting for him somewhere else in the city. Was he hungry? Did he have family? Was he one of those veterans people always talked about in the news, the ones who somehow slipped through the cracks? The next afternoon, curiosity pushed her to action. She rummaged through her backpack and found an extra granola bar. Her mom always packed more than she needed, and a bottle of water she'd forgotten about. Her heart pounded as she approached the bench, rehearsing what to say, but when she got closer, the words dried up. He sat just as before, hands folded, eyes far away. She hesitated, not wanting to embarrass him or herself, but eventually set the granola bar and water down on the edge of the bench, a respectful distance away. He didn't look at her. Not a nod, not a word. The silence stretched out between them, thick as fog. Jasmine gave a tiny, awkward wave, then hurried inside, cheeks burning. For the rest of her shift, she kept glancing through the window. She half expected him to leave the food untouched, maybe even toss it away. But before he left that day, she watched as he quietly tucked the bar and water into his pocket, eyes darting once in her direction, just a flicker, and then back to the street. The next day, he returned. Same time, same place. So Jasmine did it again, this time with a small sandwich from her lunch and a post-it note. "Take care today." Jasmine. She almost scratched out her name, worried it might be too personal, but left it anyway. The silent ritual began. Day after day, Jasmine brought little things: an apple, some tea, a bag of chips, always with a note. Sometimes she'd sit near the window, pretending to read while watching his reactions. He never said thank you, never waved, but he always accepted the gifts. The library staff noticed, but didn't comment, at least not yet. People around her started to whisper. Friends asked why she bothered. Some thought she was wasting her time, or worse, putting herself in danger. Even her mom grew cautious, warning her not to talk to strangers, not in this city. But Jasmine couldn't help it. Something about the old man's quiet persistence made her want to reach out, even if it was just with food and a few kind words. Winter crept in, sharp and unforgiving, but the man kept coming. His coat seemed thinner now, his shoulders more hunched against the cold. One day, Jasmine brought him a pair of gloves, just cheap ones from the dollar store, and left them on the bench with her usual note. When she checked later, the gloves were gone, and for the first time, she thought she saw a smile tug at the corner of his mouth as he shuffled away. The world outside the library didn't change much. People still passed by, eyes fixed on their own troubles. But for Jasmine and the old man, something small but important had shifted. A quiet connection. Unspoken but real. And for reasons she couldn't quite explain, Jasmine felt lighter each day, as if kindness, no matter how small, had the power to move mountains, or at least warm a bench outside a library on a cold Pittsburgh afternoon. The clock struck 3 every afternoon, a subtle symphony for those who cared to notice. The shrill bell of the nearby high school, the steady thrum of traffic along Fifth Avenue, the squeak of bicycles and sneakers as students burst into freedom, laughter echoing between rows of tired brick houses. The air outside the Pittsburgh Public Library changed at this hour. It thickened, alive with the pulse of teenagers, the routine grumble of city buses, the scent of winter creeping in as November slid toward December. Nestled on a corner, in a modest suburb, the library was more than just a building of books. It was a gathering place, a warm retreat from biting winds, a refuge for homework doers, dreamers, and sometimes for the lost. Its glass doors opened and closed hundreds of times between 3 and 6 each day, swallowing up streams of kids in mismatched coats and faded backpacks. Some hurried in groups, brimming with gossip and inside jokes. Others, like Jasmine, arrived alone, her earbuds in, but only half listening, her gaze always searching for stories, even outside the pages she loved. Pittsburgh itself had a certain heaviness, a blue-collar pride that clung to its bones like the coal dust of decades past. The old neighborhoods, Bloomfield, Lawrenceville, Shadyside, each wore their histories openly, painted on the faces of corner bars and stoops, or stitched into the flannel jackets of its residents. People here moved with purpose, unhurried but never idle, eyes fixed forward but memories trailing behind. The library had its own cast of regulars, the chess players who commandeered the back table, the mother wrangling 3 kids with one hand and a library card with the other, the retired teacher who always sat by the window correcting crossword puzzles in ink. Among them, Jasmine had found a sense of belonging, a place where her questions, her quiet curiosity, were not only accepted but valued. As a volunteer, she had access to the nooks and crannies most patrons missed: the creaky staircase leading to the archives, the staff room with its ancient coffee machine, the attic that held boxes of forgotten yearbooks and newspapers yellowed with age. And outside, always at the edge of it all, was the old man. The bench, he claimed, sat beneath a sycamore whose roots threatened to crack the sidewalk. In summer, the leaves offered shade, dappling the ground in shifting patterns of light. By fall, the branches grew bare, sharp against the gray Pittsburgh sky, letting the cold settle like a blanket around anyone who lingered. He arrived like clockwork, never a minute late. Some days, he'd carry a battered thermos, its contents steaming in the chill. Other times, just himself, in that threadbare army jacket, buttons dulled and fabric patched where the elbows had given out. His presence was almost ghostly. There, but so easily missed unless you were looking for him. Most people weren't. Yet, Jasmine always looked. She'd started timing her volunteer shifts so she could catch the old man's arrival, watching from behind the safety of glass or from the corner of the steps, pretending to tie her shoes or dig in her backpack for a pencil. She became a student of his routine, noting how he sat, hands folded on his lap, eyes scanning but never meeting anyone else's gaze. Once, She caught him watching a group of middle school boys as they tumbled off their bikes and argued over who'd won their race to the library steps. There was a softness in his eyes then, a flicker of something tender and bruised. Inside, the library was a world apart, warm, buzzing with energy, full of the hush of turning pages and whispered conversations. Librarians shuffled through their rituals, scanning books, answering questions, corralling toddlers during story time. The walls were lined with posters about local events, veterans' breakfasts, food drives, and poetry readings. There were signs warning about overdue fines, reminders about holiday closures, and a faded photo of the building from when it first opened 50 years before. Jasmine felt the contrast every day. Inside, she was needed. Ms. Cooper asked her to help with the new returns. Mrs. Avery smiled when she restocked the teen fiction shelf. Kids looked for her when they needed help finding their next favorite fantasy series. Outside, just a few feet away, was a man who seemed forgotten by everyone. The glass doors might as well have been a wall, a mile thick. The weather turned colder, the first dustings of snow gathering along the edges of the parking lot. Jasmine started noticing details she'd missed before, the way the old man's breath frosted in the air, how his hands trembled as he fumbled for the sandwich she'd left, the way his eyes lingered on the library doors but never crossed the threshold. Some days she wondered if he'd always been there, if maybe she'd simply failed to see him until she was ready. Word began to spread among the students. "There's that guy again," someone would say, rolling their eyes. "Creepy, right?" a friend whispered, and Jasmine felt a surge of annoyance, though she couldn't quite say why. To her, he wasn't creepy, just sad. Maybe lonely, maybe invisible, the way she sometimes felt at school or even at home. Her mother's voice became a new background noise. "Don't get too close, Jazz," she'd say as they drove home in the dusk. "People like that, you never know what they want. The world's not as safe as it used to be." Jasmine bit her tongue, the words catching in her throat. What if nobody ever tried to know him? Wasn't that the real danger, letting people slip away, unseen, unloved? One Friday, as rain pelted the library windows and the wind bent the sycamore, Jasmine stood in the vestibule and watched the old man weather the storm. He sat through it all, shoulders hunched, jacket pulled tight. It would have been easy to ignore him, to turn away and lose herself in the warmth and light inside. But she couldn't. She pressed her palm to the glass, wishing for a way to cross the distance between them without making either of them feel exposed. She didn't have answers. But she had empathy, and a growing determination, fueled by the quiet ache she saw every afternoon, the same ache she sometimes felt in herself. The library, with all its comfort and chaos, became the stage for a quiet, unfolding act of courage. Each day, the line between inside and outside blurred just a little more. For Jasmine, the world outside that library wasn't just cold and gray. It was a place full of stories waiting to be noticed, and she was determined, no matter how small her actions seemed, to rewrite just one. There were two lives intersecting quietly at the library's edge. One belonged to Jasmine Lee, 17, a girl with a restless mind and a heart that felt too much for the world around her. The other belonged to Harold Booker, a man in his 80s who wore time like a heavy coat, shoulders bent under memories that never left. Their stories should never have met, but every day at 3, on a weathered bench beneath a shedding sycamore, something silent and powerful began to grow. Jasmine Lee wasn't the kind of girl who faded into crowds. Her hair, inky black and always pulled into a messy ponytail, made her easy to spot among classmates. Her eyes were sharp, always scanning, questioning, noticing things most people missed. She volunteered at the library not because she needed extra credit, but because she craved the sense of order among the chaos of her own life. Her father's absence, the quiet ache in her mother's eyes every evening, the feeling that she was forever on the outside looking in, all these things drove her to seek comfort in stories and in the dusty peace of the library stacks. At school, Jasmine kept her circle small. A couple of friends who understood her silences, a few teachers who appreciated her curiosity, and the books that never judged or talked back. She was the one people turned to when they needed help with homework or a shoulder to lean on. but rarely did anyone ask how she was doing. She'd learned to keep her worries to herself, to bottle up the loneliness that sometimes sat heavy on her chest. Maybe that was why she noticed the old man outside. Something about his stillness, his isolation, mirrored the secret places inside her own heart. Jasmine's compassion wasn't loud. She didn't volunteer for praise or attention, and she certainly didn't expect thanks from the stranger on the bench. She brought food because she couldn't bear the thought of someone being hungry and alone. The notes she left, short, simple, signed Jasmine, were as much a reminder for herself as for him. That kindness, no matter how small, mattered. She wondered about him often. At night, she'd lie awake imagining who he might be. Was he a grandfather, waiting for family who never came? A soldier haunted by things no one else could understand? Her mind spun stories, each one different, but all ending in the same question. What pain had driven him to this bench, this daily ritual of silent endurance? Harold Booker had once been a name spoken with pride. He'd served in the army, decades ago, when his back was straight and his eyes bright. There had been medals and photographs, parades and promises. Time, however, had a way of eroding even the sharpest edges. He outlived friends, lost touch with family, and eventually found himself left with only a few treasured memories. A faded photograph tucked inside his wallet, a son's baseball card, a wedding ring he still wore, though the hand beside him was long gone. Every morning, Harold's world narrowed. The apartment was small, cold in the winter, stifling in the summer. He counted the hours by the groan of pipes and the drone of his neighbor's TV. The city had changed around him, buildings rising and falling, faces new and unfamiliar. The only place that still felt real was the public library, the last anchor to the community he'd once known. So, he walked there every day, slow and careful, leaning on his cane and the muscle memory of years in uniform. He didn't want charity. That's why he never begged, never asked for help. Dignity was the last thing he could control. The bench became his watchpost. He saw the world spinning without him, children growing taller every week, teenagers growing bolder and noisier, old friends replaced by strangers. Sometimes he'd smile at memories that drifted in. His son's laughter echoing across a Little League field, his wife's gentle hand on his shoulder, a long-ago Christmas when everyone was still alive and together. But those moments passed quickly, chased away by the cold or by the ache in his chest that medicine never seemed to touch. When Jasmine started leaving food, Harold didn't know what to make of it. At first, suspicion. Years of self-reliance made it hard to trust even the smallest kindness. Maybe she felt sorry for him. Or maybe it was just some school project about helping the less fortunate. But she was consistent, never demanding conversation, never watching him too closely. She left the food and walked away, her steps light but determined. Over time, something in him softened. He looked forward to her notes, their neat handwriting and simple wishes. Hope today's a good one. Or stay warm out there. He never responded, but the notes stayed folded in his jacket pocket. A secret collection of hope. Harold saw things in Jasmine that reminded him of his own daughter, lost to a car accident when she was just Jasmine's age. The pain of that memory never dulled. But Jasmine's presence, the way she cared without expectation, was a balm he didn't know he needed. He watched her, careful not to be noticed, and saw a girl with the weight of the world in her eyes, yet still willing to give a piece of herself to a stranger. It was humbling. It was healing. Inside the library, people came and went, never thinking twice about the old man outside. But for Harold, each day Jasmine brought something, a sandwich, an apple, a pair of gloves, was another day he felt seen. And for Jasmine, each time he accepted her offering was proof that what she did mattered, even if nobody else understood. Their worlds, so different in years and losses, began to orbit each other. There were days when Jasmine would linger at the door, hoping for a smile or a nod. Sometimes she thought she caught a glimmer of gratitude in Harold's eyes, but most days he remained inscrutable, wrapped in his memories in silence. That was okay. She didn't need more. Still, As winter deepened and the city's grayness pressed in, Jasmine's questions grew. What would happen if one day the old man simply stopped coming? Would anyone notice but her? Did she have the courage to ask him his name? Or would that shatter the delicate peace they'd built? She wondered how many others walked through life unseen, waiting for someone to notice, to care, to remind them that kindness wasn't just a word, but an act that could bridge the widest distance. Harold Booker sat outside the library each day, not for the food or the notes, but because in Jasmine's quiet routine, he found a reason to keep coming back. A promise that not all was lost, that sometimes the smallest gestures could break through the loneliness that threatened to swallow a person whole. The world kept spinning, indifferent and loud, but on a weathered bench under bare branches, two unlikely souls found connection, not through words, but through the steady, unspoken language of kindness and presence. The weather turned raw as November gave way to December, and the wind off the river found every crack and crevice in the city. Students hustled past, heads down, hands buried deep in their pockets, breath hanging like clouds in the gray air. The world felt a little harsher, a little less forgiving, and for Jasmine, the sight of the old man outside the library grew harder to ignore. He sat alone, as always, the faded army jacket doing its best against the cold. Sometimes his hands shook, though he tried to hide it by folding them tightly in his lap. Jasmine's heart ached each time she passed him. The city could be so loud, so busy, and yet here was someone whose silence seemed to echo above it all. She remembered what her father used to say, that you could tell who needed kindness most by the way they tried to hide their hurt. Maybe that was why, on a Thursday afternoon, Jasmine lingered outside the library with a granola bar and a bottle of water tucked into her backpack. Nothing fancy, but enough to ease her own conscience. She paused by the bench, her heart beating a little faster as she looked at Harold. He didn't meet her eyes, staring instead at a spot just past her shoulder, as if watching for someone who would never come. Jasmine hesitated, then, with as much confidence as she could muster, set the granola bar and water down on the bench, a respectful distance away from him. "I hope you have a good afternoon," she said quietly, unsure if he even heard her. No reply came, not even a nod. Jasmine's face burned with embarrassment as she hurried inside, feeling silly and intrusive. But as she slipped behind the warmth of the glass doors, she glanced back just once. Harold hadn't moved, but his eyes flickered briefly to the granola bar and water. He said nothing, did nothing, but Jasmine sensed a change. A thread, barely visible, stretched between them. The next day, the bench was occupied as usual. Harold arrived at his regular time, sat in his spot, and folded his hands. Jasmine watched from inside, the granola bar and water long gone. She wondered if he'd eaten them or simply tossed them away, too proud to accept help. But then, as she pretended to reorganize the magazines near the front window, she saw him slide a scrap of paper from his pocket and study it. Her heart leapt. Was it her note? No, she hadn't left one. Just the food. She couldn't be sure, but something told her that, even in his silence, he'd noticed her kindness. Encouraged, Jasmine decided to keep going. The following afternoon, she brought a ham and cheese sandwich, her favorite, cut into triangles the way her mom used to do. She wrapped it carefully, wrote, "Take care today, Jasmine," on a bright yellow post-it, and stuck it to the bag. She waited until Harold arrived. Then, as he settled onto the bench, she approached and placed the sandwich and a small bottle of tea on the far edge of the bench. He didn't move, didn't look at her. Not a single word or gesture. Jasmine stood there, awkward and exposed, but forced herself to smile before heading back inside. For a moment, she wondered if she'd crossed a line. Maybe he wanted to be left alone. Maybe he thought she pitied him, or worse, that she was mocking him. The doubts clung to her all afternoon as she reshelved books, helped toddlers find picture books, and restocked the craft supplies for story hour. But when she peeked outside at the end of her shift, the sandwich and tea were gone, and Harold was slowly walking away, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the sidewalk. Days passed, and the ritual continued. Jasmine began to look forward to it, thinking about what small things she could bring next. A banana, a granola bar, a warm cup of soup from the corner deli. Each offering came with a post-it note, always the same gentle wish. Take care today. Sometimes she wrote little jokes or drew a smiley face, hoping to bring a small spark of light to his day. Harold never responded, never acknowledged her presence beyond a fleeting glance, but he never rejected her gifts either. The connection between them grew quietly, like a seed planted in winter. Jasmine realized she was learning patience, letting go of her need for immediate results. She didn't need to see gratitude to believe it was there. It was enough to know that someone saw her effort and allowed it, even if only in silence. Outside the library, life moved forward. The bench, once invisible to everyone but Harold, began to take on new meaning for Jasmine. She noticed small changes, how Harold sat a little straighter after eating, how his hands seemed steadier with gloves she'd left one especially cold morning, how his eyes sometimes followed her as she came and went, though he never called out. There was an understanding now, unspoken but powerful. One day, she arrived late and found the bench empty. Panic gripped her heart until she noticed Harold coming up the block, slower than usual, but with a purpose in his step. She waited until he was settled, then placed a sandwich and thermos on the bench, gave a little wave, and hurried inside before her courage failed her. Through the glass, she watched him pick up the thermos, turn it in his hands, and finally take a long, careful sip. The moment was small, but Jasmine felt it. A tiny victory in a world that too often looked away. As the days grew shorter and snow threatened in the forecast, the bench outside the library became a symbol. For Jasmine, it was proof that you could make a difference, no matter how invisible you felt. For Harold, it was a sign that kindness could still find its way through the cracks of a long and lonely life. And so, the unspoken connection deepened. Jasmine no longer wondered if her gestures were welcome. She understood that sometimes silence was the loudest. Thank you of all. In her own quiet way, she had become a part of Harold's routine, just as he had become a part of hers. A reminder that even the smallest act of kindness could change the shape of a day, or a life, forever. At first, Jasmine thought her small acts of kindness existed in a private world, invisible to everyone except herself and Harold. But kindness, no matter how quietly offered, has a way of rippling outward, sometimes in unexpected ways. As December deepened and the city shivered beneath its first dusting of snow, Jasmine discovered just how closely people watch what they don't understand. It began with whispers among her friends. On a cold Tuesday, as she stuffed a sandwich and a note into her backpack before heading to school, her best friend Nora caught her in the act. Nora's eyes narrowed, playful but curious. "Are you, feeding someone on the way home?" she teased, nudging Jasmine's side. Jasmine hesitated, weighing her answer. She wanted to protect her ritual, but secrets between friends don't last long. "Sort of," Jasmine admitted. "There's an old man who sits outside the library. I just bring him something, sometimes." Nora's face twisted in concern and a hint of disgust. "Jazz, you don't know him. He's probably homeless, right? That's weird. What if he's dangerous? He's just quiet. He doesn't ask for anything. I think he just needs someone to notice him." But Nora shook her head, half laughing, half nervous. "My mom says those people are unpredictable. Yeah, don't get too close, okay? Seriously. It's not safe." The next day, the rumors swirled a little louder. By lunchtime, someone from Jasmine's chemistry class asked, "Hey, you're the girl feeding that bum by the library?" Her cheeks burned. "He's not a bum, he's a veteran," she replied, though she really only guessed from the army jacket. The conversation was quicksand. The more she tried to explain, the deeper she sank. Some kids made jokes about her becoming the crazy sandwich lady. Others whispered behind her back, eyes darting away when she met their gaze. Jasmine's confidence wavered. She wondered if she'd made a mistake, if her small kindness was actually just a spectacle for others. It didn't help that her mother was becoming more anxious by the day. Mrs. Lee worked double shifts at the hospital, and worry had etched permanent lines on her brow. One night, as she packed Jasmine's lunch, she looked up, her tone low and serious. "Jasmine, I heard from Miss Ramsey at the library about that man outside. Are you talking to him?" Jasmine hesitated, then nodded. A little. I just leave him some food. He never bothers anyone, Mom. Her mother set the knife down, her hands trembling. You don't know his story, sweetheart. He could be dangerous. Some people don't want help. Jasmine stared at her hands, feeling the familiar knot of frustration twist in her chest. But what if everyone thinks that, Mom? Then no one helps, and he's just alone. Her mother's eyes softened, but her voice stayed firm. You have a good heart, but I need you to be careful. Promise me you'll keep your distance. If anything feels off, you tell me or Miss Ramsey, please. Even the library staff got involved, though they tried to be gentle. One afternoon, as Jasmine straightened the returns cart, Mr. Antonelli, the assistant librarian, pulled her aside. I've noticed you leaving things on the bench outside, he said, his tone gentle but edged with concern. This is a public place, Jasmine. We have rules about soliciting and loitering. I know you mean well, but maybe you should let the professionals handle it. Jasmine's cheeks flushed with embarrassment and a flicker of anger. He's not causing any trouble, she whispered. Even so, Mr. Antonelli replied, there are shelters for people like him. We have to think about the safety of our patrons. If anyone complains, I'll have to ask him to move along. Jasmine nodded stiffly, feeling the sting of helplessness. By now, even Harold seemed to notice the shift. One afternoon, as she left a sandwich and started to turn away, he looked up, just for a moment, just enough for their eyes to meet. There was a flicker of something there. Caution, sadness, maybe even gratitude. She wanted to say something, to apologize for the attention her actions were bringing him, but the words died in her throat. Their connection was built on silence, and sometimes silence was safest. Outside of school and the library, Jasmine's actions rippled into her family life. Her mother questioned her more, watching her closely, checking her phone, even asking Miss Ramsey to keep an eye on her daughter's shift schedule. Jasmine felt the invisible net tightening, her world shrinking as suspicion and concern grew, but the hardest part was the loneliness that followed, the sense that no one truly understood. Even Nora, her closest friend, stopped walking with her after school, claiming she had to get home early or that her mom didn't want her near the library anymore. Jasmine sat alone at lunch sometimes, staring at the cold sandwich her mother had made, thinking about the bench outside, or about the old man waiting in the cold. In the community, too, judgment was everywhere. Some parents wrote on the school Facebook page about the vagrant by the library, demanding the police do something. The library's director had to send an email to staff, reminding them to be vigilant and to call the authorities if loitering became a problem. Jasmine overheard all of it, each new comment a weight on her shoulders. Yet, every day, at 3 o'clock, she returned to the bench. Her gifts became quieter, just a small bag of pretzels, a note folded so tiny it could be hidden in a pocket, a pair of socks tucked discreetly under a sandwich. She walked faster, kept her eyes down, but she never stopped. The pushback only steeled her resolve. For Jasmine, kindness was not about approval. It wasn't about recognition. It was about seeing someone the world had made invisible and refusing to look away. Sometimes, at night, she wondered if she was being foolish, risking her reputation, her friendships, even her own safety. But every morning, she woke up and packed a little extra food. Every afternoon, she felt a surge of purpose as she approached the bench. The whispers and warnings hurt, but she would not let them drown out the truth she knew in her heart. Everyone deserves to be seen. Everyone deserves kindness. Even, especially, when the world says otherwise. Winter settled deep into Pittsburgh, smothering the city with icy wind and heavy gray clouds. Each day, as dusk fell earlier and the streetlights flickered on before 4 o'clock, Jasmine hurried toward the library with hope and worry tangled tight in her chest. Her ritual was carved in stone by now, her backpack always packed with some little treat, a folded note, a flask of soup if she could sneak it out. She wore her resolve like armor, her kindness a quiet rebellion against the growing chill, both outside and within the hearts of those around her. But on a Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. The sycamore branches rattled like bones in the wind. Jasmine rounded the corner, scarf pulled high on her face, hands deep in her pockets, and saw, with a jolt that stopped her breath, that the bench was empty. No faded army jacket. No battered boots resting on the slush-splattered pavement. No Harold. At first, Jasmine hesitated, convinced she'd simply beaten him there. She paced the length of the sidewalk, glancing down the block for his familiar stoop-shouldered figure. Minutes ticked by. 3 o'clock passed, then a quarter after. Students poured out of the high school gates, swirling around her in noisy knots. But the bench remained empty. She waited, stubborn against the cold, her heart pounding as each passing moment stretched the silence tighter. The old anxiety crept in. What if something had happened? What if the whispers and warnings had come true? Had someone called the police? Had Harold gotten sick? Had the world, at last, swallowed up a man no one wanted to see? But Jasmine refused to abandon hope. She reached into her backpack, pulled out a turkey sandwich and a bottle of apple juice, and set them on the bench. She pressed her note beneath the juice bottle so the wind wouldn't take it. Hope to see you tomorrow. Jasmine. Inside the library, she could barely focus on her tasks. Her mind played out endless scenarios, each more desperate than the last. Had he found shelter somewhere warmer? Had his health failed him in the night? She replayed every interaction in her mind, searching for signs, clues, anything she might have missed in those silent exchanges. That night, as the city's Christmas lights blinked in windows all around her, Jasmine lay awake, haunted by the image of the empty bench. The next day, she arrived early, heart hammering, eyes scanning every face on the sidewalk. Still, the bench sat vacant. The food and note from yesterday were gone. But was that a good sign, or had someone else taken them? She left another sandwich, another note. Thinking of you. Be safe. Jasmine. She tried to convince herself he'd be back. Maybe he was just sick, or visiting someone, or had an appointment. But with every day that passed, her certainty faded, replaced by a restless ache that kept her on edge. A week dragged by in a haze of cold and worry. The empty bench became a wound she could not ignore. And each day's disappointment sharpened her sense of helplessness. Jasmine watched the other library regulars go about their routines, oblivious to the absence she felt so deeply. Sometimes she thought about asking them if they'd seen Harold, but fear of drawing attention, of exposing the old man's vulnerabilities to the wrong people, kept her silent. At school, her friends noticed her distraction. Nora tried to joke her out of her gloom, but Jasmine only managed weak smiles. He probably just found a better spot, Jazz. Or maybe someone took him in, Nora said, but her voice lacked conviction. Jasmine knew the city too well to believe in easy answers. Too many people vanished without anyone noticing. Too many stories ended without closure. Each day, Jasmine visited the bench, leaving food, notes, even a scarf she'd knitted herself. She wrote longer messages now, pouring out her hopes, her apologies, her stubborn belief that kindness could matter even when no one else saw. I miss seeing you here. Hope you're all right. If you need anything, I'll keep coming. You're not forgotten. Still, the bench remained empty. The library staff, who'd once been so concerned about her kindness, now seemed to watch her with wary sympathy, unsure how to approach the girl who sat outside, alone, each afternoon, her eyes fixed on a patch of concrete where an old man no longer appeared. Mr. Antonelli asked gently if everything was okay, and Jasmine lied, nodding, saying she was fine. At home, her mother noticed her silence, but Jasmine didn't know how to explain the hollow ache that had settled inside her. She'd never had a real friendship with Harold, not in the usual sense. There were no conversations, no shared jokes or memories, only the silent bond that came from seeing and being seen. But his absence felt as real as any loss she'd ever known. Night after night, she dreamed of Harold wandering the city streets, lost and invisible. She saw him shivering in alleyways, or sitting alone in a hospital room, his jacket folded across his lap, her notes scattered and unread. Sometimes she imagined him reunited with family, safe and warm. But these daydreams felt like lies. Winter deepened. Jasmine's hope thinned, threadbare as Harold's old coat. Still, she refused to give up. She made a promise to herself that as long as the bench was there, as long as there was a chance, she would not stop. Some afternoons, she sat in silence, letting the city move around her, feeling the loneliness that must have haunted Harold all those months. It was a strange comfort to understand so intimately how the world could move on, indifferent when someone disappears. Finally, nearly 2 weeks after Harold vanished, Jasmine left one last note, tears freezing on her cheeks as she set it on the bench. "You mattered to me. I hope you're okay. Jasmine." She stood there for a long time, until her fingers went numb, until the streetlights buzzed on overhead. Then she turned and walked away, the bench, still and empty, etched forever into her memory. But deep inside, Jasmine's resolve was changing. If Harold ever returned, she would not waste another day waiting to truly see him. She would not let fear or judgment or the cold silence of the world stop her from reaching out again. The days after Harold's disappearance felt like years, each one stretching on endlessly. Jasmine drifted through her routines in a fog, her body moving on autopilot as her mind circled the same questions. Where had Harold gone? Would she ever see him again? Had her acts of kindness even mattered? She still brought food each day, sometimes just a note, sometimes a sandwich or an apple, and left them on the bench as a silent promise. But as the weeks slipped by, even hope started to feel like a heavy burden. Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, something happened that would shatter the stillness and change Jasmine's life in a way she could never have expected. The sky was a flat, relentless gray, the kind that seemed to press down on the whole city. Rain drizzled steadily, turning sidewalks slick and pushing most people indoors. The library was crowded and humid, boots squeaking on the tile floors, damp coats dripping by the entrance. Jasmine had just finished reshelving a cart of books and was heading toward the front desk when she heard it, the deep, unmistakable rumble of engines outside. She glanced up and saw, through the streaked glass, 3 black SUVs pulling to a halt by the curb. The vehicles were clean, official-looking, out of place among the usual faded minivans and battered sedans of the neighborhood. For a moment, everyone in the library seemed to pause, the kind of collective hush that happens before a storm. The doors to the first SUV swung open. 2 men in full military dress uniforms stepped out into the rain, their hats pressed low, their medals glinting even in the dull light. From the second SUV, a woman emerged, tall and poised, dressed in a crisp, dark suit and holding a slim briefcase. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a ripple of whispers broke out across the lobby. "Is there a ceremony today? Who are those people? Did someone die?" Jasmine watched, heart thudding in her chest as the 3 figures strode purposefully toward the entrance. Rain slid off their coats, pooling around their polished shoes. They stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold, wet air with them. Every eye in the room followed their movements. Librarians paused, mid-sentence. Students peered around corners. A mother even shushed her toddler so she could hear what was happening. The woman in the suit approached the front desk, where Miss Ramsey, the head librarian, stood frozen behind her computer. The woman spoke softly, but with an authority that was impossible to ignore. "Excuse me, ma'am. We're looking for Jasmine Lee." Miss Ramsey blinked, startled. She's right over there." She pointed shakily toward Jasmine, who felt 100 stares snap onto her at once. For a moment, Jasmine was paralyzed. Her name echoed in her ears, her legs suddenly heavy as stone. She forced herself to move, setting down her stack of books, smoothing her hair with trembling hands. Every step toward the desk felt like walking through water. The soldiers and the woman turned to face her, eyes kind but serious. One of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered sergeant with lines etched deep into his face, spoke first. "Jasmine Lee?" "Yes," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "Thank you for meeting with us. My name is Sergeant McConnell. This is Sergeant Rivera, and this is Miss Bennett from Veterans Affairs." Jasmine swallowed, her mind racing with questions and fear. Had something happened to Harold? Had she done something wrong? Had her notes or food caused a problem? Miss Bennet gave a gentle, reassuring smile. "You're not in trouble, Jasmine. We're here because of your acts of kindness. You've been leaving food and notes for a man outside this library. His name is Staff Sergeant Harold Booker." At the mention of his name, something inside Jasmine loosened, a mix of relief and dread flooding her at once. The sergeant continued, "We'd like to talk with you privately, if you're willing." Miss Ramsey led them to the staff room, closing the door behind them to block out the curious stares. The small room, usually cluttered with mugs and dog-eared magazines, now felt impossibly cramped and official. Jasmine sat on the edge of a chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Sergeant McConnell began, his voice solemn. "Harold Booker was a decorated veteran. He served overseas, and he's faced a great deal of hardship in recent years. We know you were the one leaving food and notes. He never asked for help, but he always accepted yours." Sergeant Rivera chimed in. "When Harold stopped coming to the library, we were notified by a local support organization. He's been under medical care, but he insisted that before we contacted his family, we reach out to you. He said you were the first person in a long time to show him real kindness." Jasmine felt tears sting her eyes. She blinked hard, staring down at her shoes, unable to speak. She'd feared the worst, but now relief and grief warred inside her. Miss Bennet opened her briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. "This is for you, from Harold. He asked us to deliver it personally." Jasmine accepted the envelope with shaking hands. She could see her name written on the front in careful, blocky script. For a long moment she simply held it, running her fingers over the letters, the room spinning around her. "We just wanted you to know how much your actions meant to him," Miss Bennet said gently. "Sometimes the smallest kindnesses reach the deepest places. You did something extraordinary, Jasmine, even if it didn't always feel like it." The rain battered the windows as Jasmine sat in stunned silence, the envelope clutched to her chest. For weeks, she had wondered if her kindness had meant anything at all, if anyone had noticed, if it mattered when the world seemed so indifferent. And now, 3 strangers, soldiers and a woman from Veterans Affairs, stood in front of her, proof that it had. When they rose to leave, Sergeant Rivera paused by the door, looking back at her with a sad, proud smile. "You gave Harold hope when he'd almost run out. Not everyone gets the chance to do that." As the 3 guests left the library, a hush lingered in the air. Librarians and students clustered by the windows, watching the SUVs drive away. For Jasmine, the world felt changed, heavier and brighter at once. She sat alone in the staff room for a long time, the envelope trembling in her hands, 100 emotions fighting for space in her chest. Outside, the bench waited, empty still, but now somehow fuller, carrying a story that would ripple far beyond the gray Pittsburgh afternoon. The envelope in Jasmine's hands felt impossibly heavy. Her name was written across it, Jasmine Lee, in firm, slightly shaky letters that made her heart twist. All around her, the library continued its busy, rainy day routine. The distant squeals from the children's section, the soft thud of books being sorted, the rattle of the radiator. But for Jasmine, time seemed to slow, the walls pressing in as she stared at the message she'd never expected to receive. For a moment, Jasmine just sat in the staff room, fingers trembling on the paper, as 100 thoughts chased themselves through her mind. What would the letter say? Had Harold blamed her for interfering in his life? Or would he share something she could never have guessed? A piece of the silence that had surrounded him for so long? The room felt too small, so Jasmine slipped out the back door, seeking solitude in the tiny patch of garden behind the library. The rain had eased, leaving everything gleaming with droplets, the scent of wet earth sharp in the air. She sat on a cold stone bench, gathered her courage, and finally broke the seal. The letter inside was a single sheet, the writing careful and deliberate. She drew a shaky breath and began to read. Underscore, 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 underscore. Dear Jasmine, I never was much for words, at least not in person. Maybe that's why I sat out there in silence so many days. But sometimes a letter can say the things a man can't. I hope you'll forgive the scribbles. I want you to know that your kindness reached me, not just the sandwiches or the tea or the warm gloves, though all of those helped in more ways than you could imagine. But the simple fact that you saw me, not many people do that anymore. It's strange, the things a person remembers when they're get old. I spent most of my life in the Army. I was proud to serve, proud of my brothers in arms, proud of the flag on my shoulder. But life has a way of taking more than it gives sometimes. I lost friends in battle. I lost my wife, the love of my life, to cancer 10 years ago. But what broke me most was losing my son. He was your age, 17, when he was killed in a car accident. After that, I stopped believing there was much good left in the world, or in myself. The bench outside your library was my place to disappear. I wasn't looking for charity. I just wanted to remember what it felt like to be around people, to hear life happening, even if I wasn't part of it. I figured I'd just fade away the way so many old men do. But then you showed up. At first, I didn't understand it. Why would anyone care? Why would a young woman go out of her way for someone like me? It scared me, if I'm honest. I kept expecting you to stop. Most people do, but you didn't. You kept showing up with your food and your notes. And somewhere along the line, I started looking forward to 3 o'clock. Again, your notes, those little yellow Post-its, reminded me that I wasn't invisible, that I mattered, if only to one person. You helped me remember who I was before the world got so heavy. Maybe you never realized it, but you saved me. You gave me hope I thought was gone forever. I want you to know that I've had to go into the hospital. Don't worry, it's nothing you did. My body just got tired. I asked the folks at Veterans Affairs to find you, to let you know I'm safe and being cared for. I'm not alone. Not really, not anymore. You might not think much of what you did, but for someone like me, it meant the world. Kindness is a rare thing, Jasmine. You should never be ashamed of it, no matter what others say. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for being brave. If you ever doubt yourself, remember there are people out there whose lives you touch in ways you may never see. With all my gratitude, Staff Sergeant Harold Booker, underscore, 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 underscore. By the time Jasmine finished reading, her cheeks were streaked with tears she didn't try to hide. The words hit her harder than she could have imagined. She had suspected pain in Harold's silence, but she'd never known the depth of his loneliness, the grief he carried, or how close he'd come to giving up on people altogether. She pressed the letter to her chest, eyes closed, letting herself feel the weight of it all. The loss, the kindness, the tiny thread of hope they'd shared. Her hands shook, not from fear or shame, but from a strange new strength. Harold's words didn't just answer her questions. They gave her a gift she'd never expected, a sense of meaning, a reassurance that her actions, no matter how small, truly mattered. The rain began to fall again, gentle and persistent, masking the sounds of her quiet sobs. Jasmine thought of all the times she doubted herself, all the times people had warned her to look away, to let the world move on. She thought of the bench outside the library, the silence, the waiting, and realized that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to turn away. For a long while, Jasmine just sat, letting Harold's words sink in, imagining him safe somewhere, surrounded by people who cared. Maybe he would never return to the bench. Maybe she would never see him again. But his letter was proof that even a brief, silent connection could light up the darkest places in someone's heart. As she walked back into the library, the letter folded safely in her pocket, Jasmine's shoulders felt a little lighter. The world outside hadn't changed, but she had. She carried with her the quiet courage Harold had seen, and a promise to never let kindness be something she was ashamed of again. And so, on that gray afternoon, beneath the dripping branches and glowing streetlights, Jasmine Lee found the answer she'd been searching for. She'd made a difference, not just in one man's life, but in her own. Jasmine's hands were still trembling as she tucked Harold's letter safely into her jacket pocket. Even as she tried to regain her composure, she could feel the echo of his words pulsing through her, warming something inside that had felt cold for weeks. She wiped her eyes and took a few steadying breaths, but there was no time for privacy, because as she returned to the library's main lobby, she realized the world outside her quiet moment had not stopped at all. The lobby was crowded now. Word had spread quickly. Students, parents, library staff, even a few curious strangers pressed close, their voices a low murmur of speculation. Some recognized the military uniforms. Some recognized Jasmine. A few, she noticed, tried to make themselves invisible, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding. Sergeant McConnell, Sergeant Rivera, and Miss Bennett were waiting near the circulation desk. The two soldiers now stood in perfect posture, hands behind their backs, faces solemn but kind. When Jasmine approached, Sergeant McConnell gave her a respectful nod. "There's one more thing, Jasmine," he said, his voice resonant and clear enough for the room to hear. "Harold wanted you to have this. It's a challenge coin. You may not know what that is, but in the military, it means a great deal." He reached into a small velvet pouch and produced a coin about the size of a silver dollar. It was old, the edges worn, the design faded but still proud, a crest surrounded by tiny engraved words. As he placed it gently into Jasmine's palm, she felt the weight of its history, the chill of its metal, and the warmth of the hands that had carried it through decades of hardship. Sergeant Rivera stepped forward. Veterans carry these coins for the people they respect most, or to commemorate acts of courage and honor. Some coins are handed out by commanders. Some are exchanged between friends who have been through the worst together. It's a symbol of trust, loyalty, and gratitude. Harold has carried this one for 50 years. Jasmine stared at the coin, her heart pounding. "Why me?" she managed, barely above a whisper. Miss Bennett smiled gently. "Because you showed the kind of courage and compassion that changes lives. Because you did something so many others would never dare. You saw him when others looked away, and you showed him he wasn't invisible." The room had grown silent. For a moment, even the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rainfall faded into nothing. All eyes were on Jasmine, and for the first time in her life, she did not want to disappear. She stood straighter, her fingers closing around the coin, feeling the imprint of its years pressing into her skin. Sergeant McConnell's voice grew formal, ceremonial. He stepped back with Sergeant Rivera and Miss Bennett, and together, as if by unspoken command, the two soldiers snapped to attention. With perfect precision, they raised their right hands in salute, not to a flag, nor to a superior officer, but to Jasmine. It was a gesture that transcended words, one steeped in the deepest traditions of respect. For a moment, Jasmine's breath caught. Her cheeks flushed, tears stung her eyes, but she held herself steady, refusing to look away. As the soldiers held their salute, the library fell utterly silent. The onlookers, librarians, students, parents, stood transfixed, some with hands over their mouths, some with tears running freely. Even Miss Ramsey, the head librarian, was speechless. In the hush, something shifted. The story of Harold Booker and Jasmine Lee was no longer just a private exchange on a cold bench, but a lesson for everyone watching, a living proof that one person's kindness could ripple through a whole community. Jasmine's thoughts spun in every direction. She remembered every moment she doubted herself, the whispers behind her back, the warnings from her mother, the fear that she was foolish or naive. She remembered how lonely it had felt, leaving those first sandwiches, not knowing if they were wanted. Now, standing in a sea of faces, she understood that true courage wasn't loud or showy. It was quiet, persistent, stubborn. It was seeing someone no one else saw and refusing to turn away. Finally, Sergeant Rivera dropped his salute and stepped closer. He spoke quietly, just for Jasmine. "Harold asked us to tell you that you reminded him why he served. You helped him remember the good in people. He told us you were braver than you know." Jasmine looked at the coin again, turning it over in her hand. On the back, she saw an inscription she hadn't noticed before, worn down but still readable. "For service and honor." The words landed in her chest with a weight that felt like love and responsibility all at once. She whispered a thank you she wasn't sure anyone heard. The soldiers nodded once more, then turned to leave. As they stepped outside into the gray, drizzling afternoon, the spell over the library slowly broke. People began to move again, softly, reverently, some still wiping their eyes. Miss Ramsey approached Jasmine, voice hushed with awe. "I've worked here for 20 years, she said, "and I've never seen anything like that. I hope you know how proud we all are of you." Jasmine could only nod, overwhelmed, the coin pressed against her heart. Later, as she stepped out into the rain, she paused at the bench, the same one where she'd first noticed Harold, where she'd left so many sandwiches and notes. She sat quietly, letting the coin rest in her palm, the cool metal grounding her in the moment. She looked up at the sky, the branches dripping above her, and felt, for the first time, not the ache of loss, but the fullness of a life that had touched another. In the gentle fall of rain, she could almost hear Harold's voice, and the gratitude woven through every line of his letter. The world moved around her, cars splashing through puddles, distant voices echoing, the steady pulse of city life. But Jasmine sat in peace, the challenge coin in her hand, knowing that in a world so often blind to suffering, she had seen, she had acted, and she had mattered. The day after the ceremony, Pittsburgh seemed changed. Snow clung to rooftops, turning the city soft and quiet. The library, once just a place Jasmine came to escape, now felt like the heart of something far bigger, a reminder that small, unseen acts could ripple out and alter the course of more lives than one could ever count. Jasmine walked to the library bench every afternoon, even after Harold's story had been told and the soldiers had returned to their distant bases. The challenge coin rarely left her pocket, its weight a reminder of the honor she'd been entrusted with, and the responsibility she felt now more than ever. Some days, Jasmine sat alone on the bench, letting her thoughts drift. She'd watch the high school kids laughing, backpacks slung carelessly, or parents wrangling their children on their way inside. Other times, a neighbor or classmate would join her, asking softly about what had happened. They all wanted to know the story. She told them the truth, that it had started with a simple sandwich, a granola bar, a cup of tea, that for a long time, she hadn't even known Harold's name, that she'd never expected anything in return, least of all, a letter, or a coin, or a salute. She tried to explain that kindness was not a project or a performance. It was a habit, a decision made quietly every day to pay attention, to keep showing up. Some days, the bench felt emptier than others. Jasmine missed Harold's presence, the silent bond they'd shared. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and almost hear the shuffle of his boots, the faint clearing of his throat. She found herself still packing extra food, almost out of instinct, and occasionally she left a note for some new stranger. A word of encouragement, a small treat, just in case. In the weeks that followed, Jasmine noticed subtle changes in the world around her. Nora, her best friend, started volunteering at the local animal shelter. Miss Ramsey organized a winter coat drive for veterans. The library set up a bulletin board called Kindness Stories, where people could pin little notes about things they'd done for others, or that others had done for them. Even the students who'd once laughed at Jasmine's weirdness now nodded hello, some of them quieter, more thoughtful than before. And Jasmine herself? She was different, too. The self-doubt that used to gnaw at her faded a little more each day. She learned that courage didn't mean being fearless. It meant acting in spite of your fear, again and again, until the fear grew small. She understood now that the world's approval was fleeting, but the impact of kindness lasted. Each time she held the challenge coin, she felt the echo of Harold's gratitude and her own hope that she could be worthy of it. She wrote about her experience for the school newspaper, not to seek attention, but because she wanted others to understand. Most of us walk past people every day and never stop to look. We forget how much it means to be seen, especially for those who feel invisible. What I learned from Harold is that even the smallest gesture, a sandwich, a note, a moment of your time, can be the difference between hope and despair. You never know who you might save with your kindness. Her words resonated with more people than she expected. Students asked her how they could help. Teachers thanked her for the reminder, and a few strangers, older men and women, faces lined by years, stopped her on the street just to say, "Thank you." Jasmine felt awkward at first, but gradually she realized that what she and Harold had shared was not just theirs, but something that could belong to everyone. On the first sunny day, in weeks, Jasmine sat on the library bench with the coin in her hand. She traced the faded letters for service and honor, and let her mind wander back to the beginning. The quiet old man in his worn jacket. The way he watched the world but never asked for anything. The first granola bar left without a word. She smiled, thinking how simple it had been, how easy it was to make the first step, and how impossible it was to know what would come from it. She knew now that kindness didn't always have to be loud or visible. Sometimes it was best when it was small, steady, and persistent. Sometimes you never saw the results. But sometimes, if you were very lucky, you got to see someone smile, or hear their story, or hold a coin that meant the world to them. As the sun dipped behind the city skyline, Jasmine stood and pressed the coin to her chest one last time. She whispered a thank you, partly to Harold, partly to herself, partly to the world for giving her the chance to matter. She turned to go, but before she did, she taped one more yellow post-it to the bench, the same as always. "Take care today, Jasmine." And as she walked away, she felt lighter, braver, more hopeful than she ever had before. She didn't do it for recognition, just kindness. And somehow, that healed a part of a soldier no one else could reach. Never underestimate the power of small kindness. You might be the reason someone believes in good again. If this story moved you, show your respect. Like, share, and follow for more untold stories of quiet American heroes.